Good morning, people of First Congregational Church and friends. We hope that you're having a wonderful day thus far and that you'll have a great day the rest of the day as it goes on. It's good to be with you this morning. It's a great day out. I hope that you'll get out and spend some time in the out of doors, or at least breathing in some of the fresh spring air and enjoying the day as much as you can. Yesterday, I had an experience. I got together with the church cabinet. It's probably the largest, well, it is the largest group meeting I've been to for the last several months. And it was quite pleasant. We met out in front of the church under that big shade tree. We were in a big circle. We exercised social distancing, and we all wore masks. But I've got to say, I was quite impressed with your cabinet. You've got some good leadership at the church. Some good ideas came out. Good conversation. You've got some quality people in charge of things that go on at the church. Some good ideas were shared, and I've got to say, although I can't tell you what they are at this point, some good ideas came up, some creative approaches to getting back together, and that's what we were meeting about, is how we get back together, what the church is going to look like, how we do it safely. Our primary concern, of course, is safety. We don't want anybody to be exposed to the virus or in any way to endanger their health or risk their lives by coming to church. We know that we all want to get back together as soon as we can, and we're working to do that. We want to do so in a creative and a safe way. And so we've got some good ideas, and you'll be hearing about those in the next couple of weeks. So plan to see one another fairly soon. But in the meantime, stay safe, stay home, do what you need to do to keep away from that virus. Like most of you, I suppose, I've watched the news and was a little bit shocked over what happened on Memorial Day for gatherings. People in pools together, people in restaurants together, people in bars together, without masks, without social distancing. And I predict, like everybody else, that there's going to be a second wave of this whole thing going through, because those people will get it themselves or not, or carry that virus back to their family and to their friends and to their grandparents and to their kids and to their elderly relatives. So that's a kind of a shocking thing. That wave seems to be, to me, at least inevitable. Now, maybe I'm scientifically wrong, I don't know. Young people, I saw one young man interviewed on the TV, and he said, well, if I get it, everybody else will get it, so we'll all be in the same boat. And I thought, that's the voice of youth, rather foolish and somewhat narcissistic, but that's how young people are, and perhaps I was that way when I was young too. I'd like to think that I wouldn't be, but who knows, maybe I was. But I was more disappointed in some of the adults that did the same kind of thing, had the same kind of attitude, that it just doesn't matter. If I get it, that's fine. It doesn't matter to them that they might be passing on to someone else, whether intentionally or unintentionally. They may be risking other people's lives. So that was rather disappointing to see that happening in adults. But I'm more grateful for the massive number of people who have been responsible for millions of people who have done social distancing and worn masks and done what we're instructed to do by the scientists and by government to be safe and to keep others safe. And I hope that we don't forget that even in the midst of irresponsible people, there are a vast majority of responsible, compliant people who do what needs to be done to keep us all safe and to be in good health. What did you do on Memorial Day? I hope that you were able to see some family virtually, if not in person, that you were able to get out, and perhaps you went to a cemetery to visit some graves. I know that's something that a lot of people like to do, and certainly is an appropriate thing to do, especially if you had someone who was killed in the military and in the service of their country. Sue and I went for a walk later in the afternoon. We made beef stew. We watched a couple movies on TV. And we spent some time remembering those who had died. Now, we don't know anybody in our current lives who is in the military and in danger of dying, but we've known relatives over the years who have passed away, having served their country. And so that we want to remember those people, and those people that we don't know personally, we want to remember them too and honor them on a day like that. Then later in the afternoon, we Zoomed with my daughters, one in Cincinnati, one in Austin, Texas, and their two sons, one 7 months old, one 9 years old, and with their husbands, of course. And that was a good time. And I'm so thankful for technology. It is a wonderful thing that we can be hundreds of miles apart and be virtually together. So just like today and like on Sundays, that we can still have our worship services even though we can't gather. We can, in a sense, be together in spirit. And that you can see me, I can't see you, but, but at least we have a one-way communication, and we can be together in that way, and hopefully that helps us to keep together as a congregation and as people. One minister, well, on Sunday morning, Sue and I watched several worship services. We watch one in South Carolina, one in Wisconsin, one in Ohio, and two here in Michigan, ours and the Mount Hope Church where I was a minister for many years. And I've got to say, ours is probably the best of any we look at. Once again, thank you to Michelle. She does an amazing artistic, technical job of putting it all together in a beautiful way. I can't sing her praises high enough. So thank you, Michelle, if you're watching this today. You deserve a pat on the back and a hug and a thank you from all of us. But over at Mount Hope, the minister there did a creative thing, and more creative than I would have ever thought of doing, and I really enjoyed it. What he did was, instead of a regular sermon, we were standing behind a pulpit or behind a lectern or behind a music stand, he took his congregation on a field trip. First of all, they went down to a war monument at Lazar and an Outer Drive, and it's in kind of disrepair, but it's a memorial to fallen soldiers. And all around the monument, it's a big block of a kind of a thing. And on each side, it either has a quotation from Abraham Lincoln or I think it was FDR. And on the other side, it has images of soldiers. It started off with a Native American and the wars fought there. Then it went through the American Revolution, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and other wars as well. And it was just impressive to see that and to think about those people who have given their lives. Then he took us to the Mount Hope Cemetery in Livonia, where in the middle of the cemetery is a large American flag, and surrounded by flags of almost equal height of the various different military services in the United States. And that was so impressive to think of what's going on there. Then he took us to a grave site and a stone, and he gave us the name of the person that was listed there, and he said, I don't know anything about this man, but I know his name. I know that he served his country as a staff sergeant in the Army, and that he died in such a day. And that was moving to realize that, yes, these are real people who give their lives. And they're not just some number or a name, that they are real people. They had families, they had hopes, they had dreams. And so we want to be thankful for them and the sacrifices they made. This technology thing again, back to that. I wonder how it's going to change our society. I've said for many years that our grandsons will never go to a college like we did, that by the time they get that old, colleges will be so expensive that no one except for the super rich would be able to send their kids to college. And I predicted that college would all be online. And I think I'm kind of a prophet in that regard, because that's starting to happen now. The colleges are finding out that students can, in fact, do online courses as well, and they don't have to have the brick and mortar being there in person. They don't have to have the physical professors and all the salaries, and so they can do college that way. And I've always thought that was the wave of the future, and it's come a lot quicker than I expected. And I suppose homeschooling will be on the increase as a result of all of this, because parents don't want to send their kids back to germ-infested schools where they're rubbing shoulders with other kids who might have the virus or some other disease. So keeping them safe might be an issue as well. So there'll be more homeschooling. But one of the things that I'm afraid of is that people might become afraid of one another. We've practiced social distancing for 2 or 3 months now, and Keeping 6 feet away is recommended, and that's what we do. And I hope that doesn't keep us from hugging one another, getting together like we used to. But it may. It may cause us to be just a little bit hesitant touching other people. So I hope that doesn't happen, but I guess we'll have to see how that all pans out. The last few weeks I've been bringing you little biographies about people in the Bible, people who are significant, people who have done amazing things, people who can be examples to us. And so far, I've only used Old Testament characters. I find the characters in the Old Testament just so colorful and so flamboyant and so audacious in everything they do that I find them interesting. But today I want to talk to you about a New Testament character, one who certainly could have fit in the Old Testament spectrum of great personalities just as well. His name was Saul, sometimes called Paul, and throughout his Christian ministry, almost always called St. Paul or the Apostle Paul. He was one of the most influential leaders in the Christian church. He was probably one of the men who influenced the world more than almost any other man who has ever lived. He started at least a dozen churches. He's traditionally considered the author of 13 books of the Bible, and often considered one of the most influential people in human history. Now, some people think that Paul wrote more of the Bible than anyone else. That's not really true. In fact, it's a great trivia question. Who wrote more in the Bible? Who wrote the most in the Bible? The answer is John. John wrote the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, in the book of Revelation. John wrote more words, but Paul wrote more books, if you understand what I'm saying. And so the answer to the trivia question, who wrote more of the Bible? The answer is John. But Paul did a good job, and Paul's job was to define theology. Jesus taught love and the kingdom of God. He taught how to be with one another, and he started the Christian church. But it was Paul who took Jesus' words and amplified them and refined them and defined them and made them into a theology. And so it's Paul who taught the church how to believe and what to believe. And so who we are is a direct result of what Paul taught and said and wrote. But before he was known as the tireless champion of Christianity, Paul was actually known as a persecutor of Christians. Before becoming a follower of Christ, Paul was a prime example of the righteous Jew, a Pharisee, just like his father. He was a Pharisee, a very religious leader. He was well educated, and he was a Roman citizen. He was a Roman citizen, and he was also Israeli, and so he had that dual citizenship, which would come in handy later on when he was on trial. And he proclaimed that he was a Roman citizen, so they couldn't execute him at that point. But Saul, when he was called Saul, saw Christians who were predominantly at that point a Jewish sect as a scourge against Judaism. Now, from Paul's perspective, these people were blaspheming about God and leading God's people astray. He believed that Jesus was a mere man and was therefore rightly executed. He got what he deserved for claiming to be God. And so Paul understood what Jesus was saying. He just didn't agree with it and said that it was blasphemy for him to say it. Paul was the kind of a man who was dedicated to whatever work that he was assigned to do. His particular job now was to persecute Christians. And so we see a little vignette of him the first time that we see him, that when Stephen, the follower of Jesus, was being stoned for what he was saying, what he was teaching, the story says that a young man was standing there who held the cloaks of those who were stoning Stephen, whose name was Saul. So Saul was there at the first martyrdom of a Christian, and he witnessed it, and he endorsed it, and he held the coats of those who were doing this evil deed. But one day, not too long after that actually, Saul was on his way to the city of Damascus. And on the way, he saw a great light, and he heard a voice, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he understood that the voice had to be none other than Jesus himself. And that day, even though his traveling companions didn't hear the voice nor see the light, he did. it was very clear to him who it was and what was going on. From that day on, Paul considered himself an apostle, a follower of Jesus. Now, an apostle is defined as one who has walked and talked with Jesus, who was a disciple of Jesus, who knew Jesus. Now, Paul never met Jesus in the flesh. But because he said Jesus talked to him out of that cloud, out of that light, he did have a conversation with Jesus, and therefore he deserved rightfully to be called an apostle. And that's the reason we call him the Apostle Paul, even though technically he probably wasn't in the traditional sense of that word. Paul established a number of churches. I think I said he established about a dozen churches throughout Europe and Asia Minor. And he was typically driven towards regions that no one had evangelized before. Nobody had been there before with the gospel, and Paul went in there. And he considered himself an evangelist to the Gentiles. And he said that Gentiles need to come to Christ. It does not, this Christianity thing does not need to be a Jewish sect only, but it should be open to all people, men, women, children, and Gentiles. So Paul butted heads with Peter over that issue, because Peter said, yes, I suppose Gentiles can come into the Christian religion as long as they obey the law, the Jewish law, as long as they're circumcised. And Paul says, no, there's no difference between Jews and Greeks. There's no difference between men and women. There's no difference. And circumcision is irrelevant. We don't need to do that. We are justified by the grace of Christ, by his crucifixion, by his resurrection. We are justified by grace, not by works, not by the law. The law has nothing to do with it, neither does circumcision, neither does nationality. Now Christianity is open to all people. And so Paul went throughout the world talking to Gentiles. Yes, he could have talked to the Jews. He was a Jew himself. But he decided that the church needed to expand beyond just Judaism to the entire universe of humans in the world. So he took 3 major missionary journeys. Some of them were years long, in which he established churches. And then when he was establishing one church, he'd be writing letters or epistles to the other churches. And that's where we get most of his writings that are in the Bible. They're called epistles. They're letters to the churches. They're addressing specific issues that those churches are facing. Perhaps it's leadership, perhaps it's finances, perhaps it's doctrine or theology. And so what Paul does is he writes those churches about those issues. Now, we don't always know what the issues are, but we do know Paul's responses to them. And so we can kind of guess what their issue was from what he's saying that they should be doing about it. But in the process, we get all of this theology about what to believe and how to act and how to be Christians. And so Paul went throughout the then known world. He went throughout all of the countries around the Mediterranean, and then he went into Turkey and other places. And he's said to have traversed 10,000 miles. Now, 10,000 miles back then is not 10,000 miles today. 10,000 miles back then was either walking or on a mule, and some of his route was on a ship, of course. But there were no emails, there were no texts. He wrote it all. He wrote it all, except that he didn't actually physically write it. He had what's called an amanuensis, which is a recording secretary. And what he would do is he would recite what he wanted to tell the churches, and this man, probably a man, would write it down, and then they'd send it off, and that would become the epistle. And so we know that because at one point, one of the epistles, Paul says, I'm writing this in my own hand, which indicates that the rest of it wasn't written in his hand. And so he used that secretary function to do the physical writing while he dictated. But he went all throughout Greece, through Macedonia. He was shipwrecked 3 times. The scriptures say that he was beaten, that he was imprisoned, that he had 6 assassination attempts or plans for assassination. So Paul was a man who was passionate about what he did, and once he became a Christian, he was super Christian. He did everything possible to proclaim the gospel of Christ to the world and to his world. Well, the story ends with him in house arrest, where he continued to write his epistles to encourage the churches to define for us our theology. No one knows exactly how he died. Tradition says that he was beheaded. Nobody knows for sure. But we do know that Paul was a man who was passionate about life. Whatever he was assigned to do, he did it 100%. When he was a persecutor of Jews, persecutor of Christians rather, he persecuted Christians as much as he could. When he became a Christian, he became the best Christian that anyone's ever known. And so Paul was one of the most influential people in all of our world, and he has impacted our lives in significant ways. Every Sunday morning when we hear sermons, we hear almost inevitably something that Paul said, or some kind of a theology or idea that Paul proposed. So that's it for today. Let's close with a prayer for a good day ahead. Let's pray with me, please. Gracious God, thank you for this day that you've given to us. Thank you for the sunshine, for the warm weather. Help us to enjoy it. Help us to enjoy you. Help us in our own lives to live the kind of life that you want us to live every day. Be with us this day, throughout this week. Help us to be safe and to be happy, to be healthy. In the name of Jesus, amen. Do have a good day.